this meeting comes after a rough year in U.S. China relations, where we've had tensions in the South China Sea, East China Sea, Yellow Sea, with North Korea over other issues, including economics. And this is a chance to sort of pull things back together again. And we've seen this developing over the last few months since the notion of a state visit got on the agenda in September. There have been visits back and forth to try to manage the hot spots like North Korea. And progress has been made there. There's been a cessation of the escalation in threats and counter-threats on the peninsula, at least for the time being. We've had a resumption of military-to-military dialogue. That will be completed and renormalized when Secretary Gates goes to China next week. Chinese foreign minister is here this week to pave the way for the upcoming two presidents to talk. And so the trip will have a symbolic value as sort of putting an end to that period of disturbance in the relationship this past year. But I think it has a greater importance going forward. We're going to go into a key election year, not just for the U.S., but for Taiwan, Korea, and even in its own way, China, which has a selection process for a new political leadership in 2012. It's going to be a difficult period to get through because every country has its own domestic political pressures and economic concerns. And so the two presidents have a chance this time to sort of set the main contours of the relationship going forward and to establish action-forcing events, exchanges of other high-level visitors. We pretty much know who the next Chinese president will be, Mr. Xi Jinping, but we don't know him very well. And it would be good to get him in this country for 10 days and let him have a look at us and get a measure of each other and get him somewhat invested in the relationship as well. Vice President Biden can go to China. We can have others in the successor generation of China's leaders get over here over the next 18 months and get all of them to take a little bit of skin in this game of the U.S. China relationship, to have some sense that they have a bit of ownership. And that, too, will help us weather the natural tensions that arise in a big relationship and between two very different countries like the U.S. and China. In the case of President Hu Jintao of China, it's his farewell visit to the U.S. It'll be a capstone of 10 years in office as President of China and Chairman of the party, and General Secretary of the party, I should say. And for him, it's a way of showing that he's the master of the game. He's set the future. He's given guidance to his successors on how to proceed. For Mr. Obama, of course, there's a lot of domestic byplay going on in the U.S. as the overreach of the first 2 years has now been offset by big Republican gains in the House and Senate. And Mr. Obama's got to work in a narrower set of constraints than before. And I think he's going to discover that it's a lot more fun being the foreign policy president than being the domestic policy president. And getting China right in his first term in office will be important to his re-election bid. The Republicans will certainly beat him up if he's seen to be weak on China, but they'll beat him up if he doesn't handle China right. And so for him, it's a matter of finding the right elements to reinforce the positive in our relationship with China. And by that, I mean get them to help us on North Korea, Cambodia, South China Sea, Iran. We've had some progress in a number of these areas. We also have a common interest in the global financial crisis and its aftermath, and how to get both of our societies prospering again. And there are policy matters at the top. And the two presidents, I think, can reinforce their domestic messages with their international cooperation, both bilaterally and within the G8 and the G20. The twin fears are Chinese fears of American containment and American fears that China's trying to knock us off our #1 position. In both cases, these are journalistic or media frenzies, and they get a lot of support in public opinion. And trips like this to the United States by President Hu are opportunities to sort of send a contrary message, to send a pushback message on those fears. It's, I think, a very simple thing for President Obama during the course of this visit to reiterate that the U.S. has no intention of containing China. Moreover, if you think China's being contained by the U.S., where's the evidence? We have 130,000 Chinese students in America's best universities. We have a trade imbalance that we would never permit to run with an adversary like the Soviet Union or a wartime adversary. We have technology transfer and investment flows, personnel flows that are just incompatible with the concept of containment. Moreover, if we ask the other countries of the region around China to contain China, they'd run for the exits. But on the other side of this, Americans need some reassurance that China understands that the international system within which China is now prospering is one that is worth preserving, and that China should not try to upset the apple cart because it feels that it's finally back on the world stage with a strong economy and an improving military position. And the Chinese officially give us reassurances, but they don't do a lot of it in public. And in the last few years, China's domestic media have multiplied without control from the top, except on very sensitive issues like Tibet or Xinjiang or Taiwan. And so people have felt free to take swipes at the U.S. and say all sorts of things in that new, more open media market. And it's important for the Chinese leadership to provide counterbalance to that by saying some of the more sensible things that need to be said. Currency is a part of the debate, even though it's the wrong part of the debate to be had. It's like measuring your health by the length of the toenail growth you get every month. We ought to be looking at the health of the whole patient. China has an imbalance in its domestic growth strategy. It puts investment way ahead of any country in history. And this, by its nature, forces other trading relationships into deficits. China needs to reduce the size of the delta of investment over consumption and reverse it eventually. But they have still a lot of countries still to develop. And so maybe another 10, 15 years before they get to the point where the investment and the consumption lines cross over. In the case of the United States, we've been on a spending binge and a debt binge for too long, and we have to get that under control. I'm more optimistic that China, with its undemocratic system, will get to the point of changing their policy direction faster than we will with our democratic system and all the. We usually need 3-4 elections to get a big change in direction, and China has the luxury of making a decision on a dime, and so we're going to have a mismatch there, and that mismatch will be the source of tensions. And as we have each election cycle, we'll have people who want to blame China, whether it's the currency or the investment pattern or unfair market access practices. These will all be part of the debate. Again, this is something that leaders can do a lot to put into context during the course of the coming summit. The standard narrative is that China is more aggressive and assertive in recent times. And as I've looked back over the year, it occurs to me that actually almost every incident was something that happened to the Chinese to which they responded strongly. So it's not really a case, in fact, that China is being actively provocative, but rather that China is reacting too strongly and not and too much in accord with public opinion as opposed to it being in accord with China's long-term interests. Toward the end of 2010, we saw some indications from important foreign policy officials in China that they've recognized that the last year has left a bad impression, not just on the U.S., but on many of China's neighbors, and it's caused China's failure to move quickly to cap the provocative behavior of North Korea, plus the other incidents that have occurred, have caused the U.S. and our allies and friends in the region to grow closer, and that was not necessarily a Chinese objective. So they seem to be reconsidering now and trying to send more reassuring signals, and this summit should be a chance for them to make further reassurances and to try to set the tone for the coming, as I say, coming couple of years, where all of us will be on tightly wound political springs and quick to respond to anything that happens, and we need to sort of calm at the center of these two governments in order to deal with these negative impulses. We had very poor cooperation in the first part of the year. At the G20 summit in Toronto in June, President Obama used a press conference after his meeting with Hu Jintao to say the Chinese were willfully blind to the provocations that were coming out of North Korea. More recently, this past fall, North Korea, with its demonstration of enriched uranium facilities and its shelling of Yongbyon Island in south of the dividing line between North and South Korea, really went too far, and even the Chinese couldn't hide the trouble that was coming. I think the Obama administration used deft diplomacy, direct communication, and envoys to go to the Chinese and say, look, this is getting dangerous, seriously dangerous, and it's time to pull back. Now, the Chinese haven't told the American government that they pulled the people back in North Korea, but the evidence to people like me is pretty clear that China has finally exercised necessary influence. Will it last forever? Probably not. But we can use this period between now, the summit, and thereafter to try to restart inter-Korean diplomacy, to see if we can get a more constructive path with which to deal with North Korea's threats and potential threats. That's not a guarantee because the North has had many years of doing well by being bad, and we want to try to get them off that path. It does have new naval capabilities that it has not had by choice for 600 years. And they now have far-flung interests, investments and trading patterns, reliance on overseas supplies of commodities that they haven't had for 600 years. And so they want to be able to protect those, and they're building their Navy out. We have genuine differences over access to, by military vessels to exclusive economic zones. I think China's wrong. China thinks the U.S. position is wrong. But we don't have a mechanism for adjudicating this. So we need diplomacy to sort of work our way around conflicts over these issues. But the Chinese military is, it's better, it's more accurate, and its firepower is larger, but it's not up there with us for a long while to come. And the U.S. got into a bad position with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't think that's a brilliant observation. But one of the good things about the last couple of years is that the Obama administration has conscientiously set out to rebalance our forces and to refocus attention on East Asia. We spent the decade of the 2000s really on counterterrorism in Iraq. A lot of money spent, a lot of time lost, a lot of inattention to other parts of the world. China walked all through Asia like a commanding presence because the U.S. wasn't taking its share of responsibility for its own interests in that part of the world. Obama's administration, to its credit, and I would have hoped any Republican administration would have wanted to rebalance that. We get our military forces back into the places they belong to in East Asia, and we have to upgrade some capabilities to match the changing military circumstances. These are not more expensive. These are less expensive, and the rebalancing should overall not strain our ability to meet our military requirements to protect our interests. We've got other strains in our economy, but the military itself, with this kind of rebalancing, will get better effect for the money spent. Well, the rare earths issue has not been well understood in the public. I heard Ambassador Huntsman speak to this recently on a Charlie Rose interview, and I thought he handled it well. That the public narrative isn't quite right, but the fact is there's a rare earth shortage in the world, and these are expensive products to produce, both in terms of money and in terms of environmental degradation. China has given us a wake-up call. Much as we came to rely on the Chinese in the 90s and sort of let go our own productive capabilities because we could get it cheaper and faster from China, now there's too big a demand for China to meet it. And we need to reopen our facilities, and that's being done. Australian and Canadian and other facilities need to be reopened as well to provide the world for its appetite for rare earths and all these new high-tech products. There's an interesting debate going on in China about nationalism. Some very thoughtful people are writing some very interesting articles that I haven't seen reflected in American media or even translated here yet, about how China has sort of let the anti-Tibetan feeling toward foreigners who protested about Tibet combine with the pride over the Olympics and pride over the Shanghai exposition and pride over hosting the Asian Games. And they sort of got a swelling up of triumphalism in China. And thoughtful Chinese are saying, hey, you know, this is getting out of hand. We're getting too puffed up. There is also a legacy. After the Tiananmen disaster in 1989, the Chinese embarked on a patriotic education campaign. And kids who don't remember 1989 do remember all those lessons they got and China's humiliation at the hands of foreigners and how they should be more patriotic. And they're now coming into adulthood. And so it's to be expected that you would see this kind of rise in Chinese nationalism. The important question is, how do the leaders of China channel that energy? In government, you look for action-forcing events. Bureaucracies don't do things until they're catalyzed to do things. And one of the best ways to move a bureaucracy in either China or the U.S. is to have leaders engaged in meeting other leaders and wanting to come back with something to show for having been involved. One alternative is always come back and say, I sure showed them how tough I was. But that's not the prevailing mood, and it leads us in the wrong direction. So I think we'll see that scheduling a regular series of high-level visits between the two countries will do a lot to get the bureaucracies to grind toward outcomes that are more positive for each side's interests. China wants more technology transfer from the U.S. It wants to be able to invest more in the U.S. And the U.S. wants to have better market access in China, fewer technological constraints on our firms, and less loss of intellectual property. We've made some progress on that with the Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade, which was more productive this time than ever before, undoubtedly because it came just before the summit. And nobody wanted to have an unproductive Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade. So the idea is to get momentum going in the relationship through action-forcing events. We also have some big events coming this year. There'll be G20 meetings in France between the leaders, and then they'll meet again when the United States hosts the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, notionally in Hawaii in November. And we'll have a whole gaggle of leaders from around the world coming together and trying to get the free trade agenda moving.